Hi everyone. Let's continue to learn about the London system by going through a Grandmaster game. This was Quang Liem versus Fabiano Caruana in 2017. So they played a double queen's pawn opening, and Liem played bishop f4, entering the London system. So let's see how Caruana with the black pieces handles it. Okay, he goes knight f6. And now e3, and that bishop is safely outside of the central pawn chain. e6, knight d2. That's usually where the knight goes in the London system. The pawn likes to go to c3 and make that little triangle. Now c5. So I mentioned before in the London system, white doesn't play c4. He doesn't play it like a queen's gambit. So this gives black the option of moving his c-pawn 2 squares to engage the center. And so it looks like a queen's gambit with the colors reversed. So it's a very typical plan of black. c3 supports the center, creates that nice triangle there, very solid. The knight develops behind the c-pawn. Knight gf3. So white is striving for that ideal setup we talked about with the minor pieces on those squares and that nice triangle of pawns. But now black plays bishop to d6, and we have a choice to make with the white pieces. So these bishops are facing each other. So we're going to learn from Liem what you're supposed to do as white. White played bishop g3. So it doesn't make much sense to just give up the bishop here in exchange and let the queen come forward off the back rank. You're just helping black develop their pieces, and you're not gaining anything from the exchange. So when the bishop comes to d6 like this, the typical thing you do is retreat the bishop to g3. Now black castled, but the point of putting the bishop on g3 is if black does take it, then you plan to capture toward the center and open the h file for your rook. So your rook all of a sudden has become active. So black doesn't normally take there. And the game progressed with castles, and then bishop d3. And we have the ideal setup, except our bishop has been nudged back to g3. So now black decides to get their light squared bishop into the game by playing b6, intending to fianchetto it. And now queen e2 is an instructive move. So one of the plans that white has in London is to push his e-pawn. He wants to achieve e4 and maybe e5 and gain a lot of space. So the queen supports that. So the queen is on the e file to support that pawn going forward, to protect it. Bishop b7. Now rook d1, also an instructive move and very subtle, but white reasons that as he pushes the e-pawn forward, his d-pawn is going to become weaker. So the rook indirectly supports it. These pieces sometimes move out of the way or get traded, and the rook supports the d-pawn. Also, the rook x-rays the queen here. It's on the same file as the enemy queen. So it makes positional sense. Rook to e8, and black puts his rook in line with the white queen. And now white pushes the e-pawn forward with a threat. So this is often what happens in the London. Black ends up with a knight on f6 and a bishop on d6, and white's pawn push here threatens to fork those pieces. So white has to, or black rather, has to address that potential fork. And black chose the interesting move e5, which is not the main move played in the position, but that does stop the white e-pawn in its tracks. It can't fork the black pieces. And it looks rather complicated with all the tension between these central pawns. Many players in this position have opted to drop the bishop back to e7 to avoid the fork. And several games have continued with e5 and knight to h5, threatening to win the dark squared bishop on g3, gaining the bishop pair. Okay, another option in this position that's not at all popular is for black to take the e-pawn. And I think white just gets a good position after knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and black hasn't accomplished much. His knight is now pinned by the light squared bishop, and white's position looks great to me. So I think in this case, you either want to drop the bishop back to e7, or you want to push the pawn to e5. And Caruana chose e5. Now there are a lot of different moves white could make here. The engine actually suggests d takes c5, but I don't really understand the long computer line that follows. Liem played d takes e5, and then knight takes e5, and the center is starting to open up. Pair of knights got traded here, and then f4, gaining a tempo on the bishop. Now, instead of retreating the bishop, though, black went for a counterattack. D takes e4, attacking the light squared bishop on d3. This looks rather dangerous to me and rather complicated because now the rooks and queens are starting to face each other and these central files are starting to clear of pawns. It looks rather dangerous to leave your queen sitting there with this white rook facing it. Okay, and that did give white the opportunity to play bishop to b5, attacking the rook on e8. And so now, not only is the rook attacked, but the bishop is still hanging, and black needs to do something about that. Not to mention there are some discovered attacks white can achieve on the black queen. So what does black do here? Well, he has to save his bishop, moves it to c7, and white gets a discovered attack on the black queen. Notice white cannot take the pawn. There's just too much danger down the e file here. For example, black wins material after rook takes knight. And then if white takes the queen, even with check, white's going to lose material after rook takes rook. And now the queen on e2 is pinned. And white can get a rook for it, but it's not enough. Black will remain up a piece, for example, like this. And black is winning. Okay, so white played knight to c4 instead, attacking the queen. Queen moved out of the way, and then white took the exchange. Okay, knight to e3, blocking the passed pawn. Very nice idea, blocking a passed pawn with a knight. It's a good positional idea. Queen to e6, castles. Queen to c6. f5, releasing that bishop along that diagonal. The bishops get traded. h6 was played. Rook d2. Queen c7. Okay, attacking the g3 pawn. Queen moves over to defend it. Bishop a6 attacking the rook. Okay, c4 blocks that. b5, b3, pawns get traded. h5. Queen f4 offering a queen trade. Okay, black trades queens. King to h7. Rook d6 attacking the bishop. Bishop moves back to b7. King f2. Rook c8. And we'll stop here. Just notice white is still up in exchange for a pawn. And white won a grueling game, lasted over 60 moves, but clearly white is winning in this position. All right, so that was how grandmasters can play the London, at least in a blitz game. So we learned a few new ideas. Thanks for watching.